What do you think makes a successful indie horror game? It turns out all you need to do is create interesting plush monsters that kids will love. That's exactly what the developers of Poppy Playtime did, which remains a household name and generates even more hype with the release of each new chapter. Poppy Playtime has a strange characteristic. It quickly expanded beyond just a game. It wasn't just players who started talking about it, kids started watching it. Plush toys, merchandise, videos, animations, and thousands of YouTube videos appeared. And that's where things get interesting. Because we're talking about a horror game that's supposed to be scary, tense, and uncomfortable, but in the end, the main symbols are characters you want to buy as toys and put on your shelf. And this doesn't seem like a coincidence, but more on that later. First, let's talk about how the game came to be. To understand Poppy Playtime, it's important to step away from the game itself for a second and look at the people who made it. MOB Games is the studio behind the project. At the time of its announcement, it wasn't some well-known team with a big name, but rather a group of people who understood the internet, YouTube, and visual imagery very well. And this is an important point. Poppy Playtime wasn't created in a vacuum. It was born in an era when horror games no longer existed solely within games. They existed in reactions, cutscenes, streams, clips, and short videos. And the developers understood this perfectly. Looking at the early materials for the game, it becomes clear the emphasis wasn't on complex gameplay or a deep plot in the classic sense. The emphasis was on the image, on a character that couldn't be mistaken for anyone else. Huggy Wuggy is the perfect mascot. Simple, just scary enough to be memorable, and yet strange enough to be engaging. And here the first important detail begins to emerge. Poppy Playtime was designed from the outset as a game to be watched. Not just played, but watched. So that the characters would be easily readable, even on a small screen, so that the scenes flow smoothly, so that the fear is clear without explanation. Now let's move on to the game itself, and the first chapter of Poppy Playtime is essentially the perfect hook. It's short, compact, and very precisely paced. There's almost no unnecessary fluff. The game doesn't overload the player with mechanics right away, nor does it dump tons of information on them. You're slowly led through the factory, shown the empty rooms, given time to get used to the space. This is where Huggy Wuggy appears. But it's not that he appears that matters, but how he does it. At first, he's just a statue, then he disappears, and only then does he become a threat. And it's a classic trope, but it works perfectly because the player has already memorized the image. In the story, we play as a former employee of the Playtime Crumber factory who returns to the abandoned factory years later after receiving a strange letter. The employees have disappeared, the place is deserted, and the only living thing left seems to be dust and suspiciously creaking doors. In gameplay, it works like a slow burn. We're introduced to Grab Pack, taught how to interact with the environment, and given time to get a feel for the space. The first chapter ends with a chase that's memorable even for those who haven't played the game at all. And that's where the moment that kicked off the wave of popularity happens. This scene became a massive hit, reactions, screams, cutscenes, memes. The game was literally made for this format. But the developers didn't stop there. The main star of the second chapter is Mommy Longlegs, a character who looks like she was conceived at the intersection of a children's toy and a nightmare after watching 3 cartoons in a row. She's constantly joking, smiling, commenting on what's going on, and at the same time, never letting you forget that you're not a guest here, but a participant in a very strange show. It's in the second chapter that Poppy Playtime really starts to play with the idea of a game within a game. Challenges, mini-games, rules that seem to explain, but also seem to simply mock the player. It all looks bright, dynamic, and looks great on video. It's no wonder this chapter generated another wave of reactions and clips. But along with this, the first crack appears. The game begins to balance between horror and an almost cartoonish presentation. At times, it becomes genuinely tense, and at others, you catch yourself thinking, so, am I running from a monster? Or going through an attraction at a very strange children's center? And this contrast doesn't work for everyone. The plot really kicks into high gear in the second chapter. We delve deeper into the factory and learn that Playtime Co. wasn't just a toy maker, but a full-fledged experimental facility. Recordings, tapes, and hints of something extremely dubious happening behind the scenes of the children's brand appear. The chapter ends with the destruction of Mommy Longlegs, and an even stronger sense that the factory isn't just the site of a tragedy, but a system that has long operated by its own cruel rules. And the further you progress, the less truly childish this world feels. The third chapter takes another step towards scale and diversity. Here, we meet new characters, and one of the most memorable is Catnap, who, incidentally, turns out to be quite creepy, unlike the monsters from previous chapters. In fact, from the third chapter onward, it becomes noticeable that the monsters are starting to almost become a collection, each with its own color, character, and quirk. Kissy Missy, for example, is no longer just a female version of Huggy Wuggy, but a fully fledged character who relies more on contrast and player expectations than on outright fear. And here, Poppy Playtime truly becomes a game where not only horror, but also recognizability is important. The characters are designed to be easily turned into toys, stickers, or avatars. Sometimes it feels like there's a checklist lurking somewhere in the game design. Is it memorable? Yes. Can I make a plush? Also, yes. At the same time, the game itself becomes more conversational. There are more explanations, more events, more action. The atmosphere of slow pressure fades into the background, giving way to constant movement. This isn't necessarily a bad thing, but the feeling changes. The game no longer hints so much as begins to speak directly. Plot-wise, the third chapter continues to expand the lore even further. The story unfolds as we confront the consequences of past experiments and learn more about the Bigger Bodies Initiative, a program that literally gave toys a new, highly questionable life form. The plot in the third chapter becomes more straightforward, more explanations, more dialogue, more attempts to connect the dots. The atmosphere of mystery gradually gives way to the feeling that the game is starting to lay its cards on the table. The fourth chapter logically takes the story to an even larger scale and introduces two important figures. The first is Prototype, the central antagonist of the story, and the second is Doughy the Doman, a character whose mood is dramatically different from anything we've seen before. If Prototype is the cold result of Playtime Co.'s experiments, then Doughy feels like a strange attempt to once again disguise horror as something friendly. The story presents him almost as a helper, a character you can interact with without immediately posing a threat. And it's precisely in this that he's more frightening than yet another chase. Doughy constantly balances between the image of a cute, silly toy and the feeling of being just another product of a system where the word friendly has long since lost its meaning. It's a monster that doesn't scream or attack, but simply exists nearby, making you question whether it can be trusted. Against the backdrop of Doughy, Prototype acts as a shadow over the entire chapter. It's not always directly present, but it's around it that events and decisions are built, and it's not a specific enemy in the classic sense, but a symbol of the entire factory and its logic. And if something can be improved through experimentation, it will be improved, no questions asked. Gameplay-wise, the fourth chapter emphasizes action and staging. Threats appear more frequently, the pace increases, and respites become fewer. The factory finally ceases to be just a location and becomes an active participant in the events. And here, Poppy Playtime no longer tries to be a subtle horror game. It becomes a series where each new chapter is meant to be bigger, louder, and more noticeable than the last. In this sense, Prototype and Doughy do a great job of showing two faces of the same system, one frighteningly open, the other alarmingly friendly. And here we come to the very question I deliberately left for later. Why did Poppy Playtime become so popular? The answer lies not only in the game itself, The plush toys, the merchandise, and the focus on children played a huge role. The characters were frightening enough to engage, but not so much that they were off-putting. They made people want to own them. The game became an entry point into an entire content ecosystem, and that's what made it popular. Does this make Poppy Playtime a bad horror game? Well, not really. It means it was made with a very clear understanding of how modern popularity works. Poppy Playtime became popular, not because it was the scariest horror game, but because it was the perfect product for its time, a game that's easy to watch, discuss, and turn into toys. And in this regard, the developers managed to please both players and children. The final conclusion is simple. Poppy Playtime is more than just a horror game. It's a product of a culture where gaming, media, marketing, and fan engagement merge into one. And if you watch to the end, you now understand why this mixture worked and continues to work. The new Chapter 5 is coming out very soon, and it will be interesting to watch the game's further development. Now, we hope the developers don't disappoint the fans,